Hi everybody, thank you for tuning in. This is Filthy Ketchup. Today we are doing an in-depth analysis of one of the world's most shocking and brutal crimes. We are discussing the case of the Snowtown killings, the bodies in the barrel killings. We are doing an in-depth analysis, which means I'll be taking you through each murder step by step chronologically, and then we will discuss the psychological impact and meaning behind the cases, because if we don't understand these cases, then history is guaranteed to repeat itself. These murders happened between 1992 and 1999. There was actually a serial killer pack, which also makes this case interesting, so we will be looking at the four killers in detail also. In mid-August 1994, the skeletal remains of a young man was found in Lower Light, Adelaide. The crimes we're discussing all took place in Salisbury North, in Adelaide, South Australia. Now, the skeletal remains of a young man was found in a paddock at Lower Light in Adelaide. The identity of that man, Clinton Tresice, will remain a mystery for 5 years. When a missing persons case, the disappearance of Elizabeth Hayden, will finally bring the psychopathic serial killer pack to bay. This is the Snowtown case. By the time that the police investigation concluded in 1999, there were 12 bodies. 8 were found dismembered and disarticulated, stored in barrels in a bank vault in Snowtown, and 2 more were found in shallow graves. One unfortunate young man, Thomas Trevelyan, was found hanging from a tree. The details in this case were so macabre, so depraved, that suppression orders had to be put in place, and 3 times the jury had to be changed because they could not handle the details of this case. The prosecution's star witness, Jamie Vlasakis, was a participant in the murders, and his psychological background, let's say, is also very interesting and plays into this case. This was a perfect storm of a charismatic psychopath, 2 henchmen, and 1 deeply disturbed young man that made the psychological and economic backgrounds just a perfect storm for this serial killer pack to happen. Why we need to understand this case is because when you have severely disadvantaged people, generation after generation, and generational abuse, then this case will repeat itself either in Australia or in the UK or America. So let's get into the case. It is almost impossible to comprehend the magnitude of these crimes, their planning and execution, the psychopathic enjoyment and bloodlust involved, the shocking reality of the underclass, and the apathy shown to the children of the underclass that generation after generation are failed by a system, either because there is just no resources to deal with the multiple problems that they have, or because the system is in itself corrupt and takes advantage of the most vulnerable in our society. This is a dark story of generational pedophilia and incest, physical, sexual and emotional abuse, the dark corruption that underlies our system and our country's elites, and of people with mental, physical disabilities and a lack of education that dooms them permanently to the welfare poverty trap. There are no heroes. There are no heroes in the welfare system, and none in the middle classes that turn the other cheek and pretend that these people do not exist. Please be prepared. As I said, this will be very, very graphic content. Let's get into the murders. I'm going to take you through each murder step by step, and then we're going to look at the four main characters, the killers in this case. The first person to fall victim to John Bunting was a young, openly gay young teenage man called Clinton Tresize. He'd had a very, very difficult upbringing. He was brought up in foster homes where he was abused by both the staff and pedophiles outside of the system. At 17, he was a happy, openly gay drifter, but John Bunting hated him because he was gay, openly gay. As I've said, John Bunting evidenced a projected hatred. He targeted Clinton. The first victim to fall prey to John Justin Bunting was a young, openly gay drifter called Clinton Tresize. Clinton Tresize was openly, happily gay, but he had had a very, very disturbed childhood and he had suffered a very great deal. He was brought up in foster care and he was abused sexually by the people in the system. He was hated by John Bunting because John Bunting openly hated gay people and pedophiles and made no distinction between the two. As I've said, John Bunting evidenced a lot of what I would call projected hatred. All of us target other people and gossip about other people because of things we hate about ourselves. And the fact that John Bunting hated gay people so much and made such a huge point of, it was such vitriolic hatred, it could only have come from projection. He was projecting what he hated about himself onto others, and Clinton Tresize was the first to fall victim to this projected hatred of John Bunting. He was 17 at the time of his death and he died of blunt force trauma. He was invited over for a meal by John Bunting, hit over the head with a shovel and then buried in a shallow grave at lower light. He was found in the early 90s by a forensic pathologist who could not identify the remains. If they had, many lives could have been saved. The next victim was a man called Ray Davis. Now, Ray Davis was intellectually impaired. He was born to intellectually impaired parents, and genetically he was just dealt a bad hand, I think. But he had there's no real easy way to say this. He had sex with dogs. When he was 13, his aunt found him having sex with the family dog, and this behaviour continued well up until his death. He was living in a caravan in a garden with a woman called Suzanne Allen, who would also fall victim to John Bunting. Now, Ray Davis would stand in her garden and masturbate as school children walked past. He would also try and entice children into his caravan for sex, and he was also bisexual. He also beat Suzanne Allen, severely beat her. And Suzanne Allen was a woman who was used to abuse from men, but even she could not stand this behaviour and banished him to the bottom of the garden. Now, Ray Davis's behaviour quickly brought him to the attention of John Bunting, who, because of his mental disability and his sexual behaviour, soon became a target for John Bunting's hatred and wrath. What makes this murder different is that the mother of Jamie Vlasakis actually participated in this murder. John Bunting and Robert Wagner captured Ray Davis, threw him in the back of a car, beat him mercilessly with golf clubs on the genitals and on the legs. dragged him back to Elizabeth Harvey's house, and Elizabeth Harvey helped to strangle him with jumper leads, you know, the leads that you start a car with. She helped to strangle him with jumper leads, and she stabbed him with a garden tool like a fork in the chest, and he actually died of asphyxiation. The next victim was a woman called Suzanne Allen. Suzanne Allen was an overweight, premenopausal, happy-go-lucky woman. She had multiple health conditions, but she made the most of her life. You know, she would paint beautiful pictures. You know, she tried her best with the best she had, but she always had very, very rocky relationships. She wasn't very lucky in love. She would consistently pick the wrong type of men to be with, and you know, she didn't have much of a chance in life, but she did not deserve the fate that John Bunting, I mean, nobody does, but what they did to Suzanne Allen was horrendous. Not only did they strangle her and suffocate her to death, but they also demeaned her and shockingly brutalised her after her death. Robert Wagner and John Bunting took pleasure in dismembering Suzanne Allen, and they made the most of it. They sawed off her hands, they sawed off her feet through the ankle joints, they defleshed her legs, her femurs, they defleshed her shins, they sawed off her arms at the arm joints, they took out all her organs, they disemboweled her, they decapitated her, they sawed through the windpipe, sawed through the neck joints, they removed the teeth, they ripped her hair out, they passed the head back and forth between them, making fun of her, "I'll kiss the puppet," dismembered her in the bath. They put her organs into a black bag, dumped it in the garden, and dumped her on top of Ray Davis. Ray Davis and Suzanne Allen were both buried in the garden. Ray Davis was buried first, and then the bits and pieces of Suzanne Allen were thrown on top, just like garbage. It was shocking and despicable what they did. The next victim was a lovely young man called Michael Gardiner. Michael Gardiner was a young cross-dresser, and by all accounts he was a lovely, lovely young man. He wanted to be a trans woman but could not afford the operation, so he took hormones and he would wear wigs and makeup. He loved Kylie and Madonna, you know, but because of this, as I said, because of John Bunting's projected hatred for what he perceived to be sexual deviance. Now, Michael Gardiner was just a fun young man who loved to dress up and he loved to wear makeup and wigs, but because of John Bunting's self-hatred and projection, he became a target for John Bunting. What they did to Michael Gardiner was absolutely horrific. They tortured him for hours on end, burnt him with cigarettes, electrocuted him, made him stand up with a rope around his neck, and would kick him in the knees. So every time he fell down, the rope would tighten around his neck, and they kept doing it, and they kept kicking him, and they kept kicking him, and eventually he fell down and he died by asphyxiation, by hanging. The next victim was a convicted pedophile. His name was Barry Lane. Barry Lane had been in a relationship with Robert Wagner when Robert Wagner was 13. when Robert Wagner was 13, he got into a relationship with Barry Lane. Now, Barry Lane was one of 11 children. He was rumoured to be a recruiter for the family. The family is, as I've explained, the family murders. It was a famous murder case in Adelaide, and the family is rumoured to be an elite network of pedophiles. And Barry Lane was strongly rumoured in Salisbury North to be a recruiter for the family. So it was said that he would get young boys for the family, for these high up judges and social workers and, you know, politicians and people like that. He would get little boys and, you know, sometimes girls for them. And Barry Lane had 2 convictions for having sex with a boy under 12. So he was the only one of John Bunting's victims who actually was a pedophile. But what they did to Barry Lane was utterly horrific. You know, they tortured him for an entire night. So for 14 hours, they crushed his toes with pliers, they electrocuted him, they forced him to call his mother and his friends and scream abuse down the phone. As John Bunting became more and more experienced in his murders, he would make his victims call their family and scream abuse down the phone, knowing that if that person went missing and, you know, they argued with their closest relatives, then their relatives might not look for them for a while. You know, he was becoming more and more sophisticated the more murders he was doing, and the time between the murders was getting shorter and shorter and shorter. So Barry Lane was forced to call his family and scream abuse. When his body was found, he had a gag around his mouth, he'd been electrocuted, he'd been burned, all of his toes had been crushed, his fingernails had been pulled out, he'd been disarticulated, dismembered, and he had been tortured for hours and hours. A teenage boy who was living with Barry Lane at the time, who was 17, a schizophrenic called Thomas Trevelyan. Thomas Trevelyan had serious mental health issues. He was serious, you know, he was schizophrenic, he was 17, and because he was in his teens and he was vulnerable, he was, you know, obviously a target for Barry Lane. Now, these people were all predators, but they were preying on each other. I mean, Thomas Trevelyan was 17 and he was living with Barry Lane at the time of his death. And Barry Lane, it is said, at the time of his death, was also living with a woman who had 3 boys under the age of 12. So, Thomas Trevelyan died by hanging. John Bunting forced him to come off his medication. It was so cruel what he did. He forced him to come off his medication for the week before his killing. This shows how much planning went into it, so that Thomas Trevelyan would start hearing voices again and become more and more confused. And then John Bunting drove him out to the woods, forced him to step up onto a crate and put a nylon rope over a tree, knotted it and put it around his neck. John Bunting deliberately tied that rope into a slip knot, knowing that that would be consistent with self-harm. He also put $6.70 into Thomas Trevelyan's pocket, knowing that that would also be consistent with self-harm, and kicked the crate out from under him. He was almost caught. As he was doing this, a couple drove up because they saw John Bunting's car, and they asked him if he needed any help, and John Bunting said, "Oh no, I don't need any help." And apparently he was standing there with Robert Wagner, and just in the background but out of the couple's sight was the body of Thomas Trevelyan swaying in the breeze. The next victim was the best friend of Jamie Vlasakis. Robert Wagner and John Bunting were responsible for this murder. Jamie Vlasakis had no idea it had happened until after it had happened. Gavin Porter was a 23-year-old heroin addict. He had a serious problem with heroin. In fact, when his body was found inside the barrels later on in the bank vault at Snowtown, the barrels toxicology tested positive for diazepam and methadone, and that came from the body of Gavin Porter. Gavin Porter had met Jamie Vlasakis at the methadone clinic. Gavin Porter was asleep on the nod in his car when Robert Wagner came up behind him and put his forearm around Gavin Porter's neck and squeezed as hard as he could. John Bunting liked to look into the eyes of the victims just before they died, and that's what he did with Gavin Porter. When Jamie Vlasakis returned home, he was invited out to the shed by John Bunting, and John Bunting showed the body of his best friend to Jamie Vlasakis and made him babysit all night. The next victim was Jamie Vlasakis' half-brother. Troy Yude had a genius-level IQ. By the time he was 2, he could recite all the colours of the rainbow and count up to 200. By the time he was 10, he could speak 5 languages. He wrote entire complicated episodes of Dungeons and Dragons that worked and were played. But Troy Yude came from a severely disadvantaged background. His father, Spiros Vlasakis, or the man he thought he was his father, Jamie Vlasakis' father, abused both him and Jamie sexually. He raped both of his sons. He sexually abused them, and Troy Yude, in his turn, sexually abused Jamie Vlasakis. Now, even though Troy Yude had a huge IQ, his poetry had been read by university professors, his writing was read all over the world, but Troy Yude came from such an economically and spiritually disadvantaged background that he had really no chance of getting anywhere. And just before his 21st birthday, he was jumped by John Bunting, Robert Wagner, Mark Hayden and Jamie Vlasakis. Robert Wagner held a pair of handcuffs, and the rest of them held table legs and bits of wood. Troy Yude was asleep in bed, and the 4 killers jumped him. They began to beat him. They severely beat him with the table legs, dragged him to the bathroom, put him in the bath and handcuffed him. They began punching him, severely beating him, and Jamie Vlasakis would later claim in court that he had no idea that Troy was going to be murdered. Jamie Vlasakis became the prosecution's star witness. Without Jamie Vlasakis' testimony, it's doubtful they would have got a conviction, and because of that, he was given a non-parole period and basically is allowed to leave prison at some point. But he's also rumoured to have boasted to fellow prisoners in jail that he enjoyed the torture of Troy Yude, and Troy Yude was severely tortured. He was forced again to make a tape to his mother, Elizabeth Harvey, scream abuse into the tape. Don't fucking look for me. I don't want to see you anymore. Leave me alone. And thinking that that would be his torture over, but in fact it had just begun. Troy Ude was electrocuted and tortured all night. His toenails were crushed with pliers. He was electrocuted. He had lit sparklers forced into the head of his penis, into his urethra. He was burned. He was burned with cigarettes. He was burned with electrical wires. He was beaten. Everything was nearly every bone he had was broken. And after his death, again, he was dismembered. He was defleshed. The muscles were cut off his legs. His femurs were defleshed. His feet were cut off. His hands were cut off. His arms were cut off. The torture and murder of Troy Ude was truly horrific. How Jamie Vlasakis really felt about it, only Jamie Vlasakis knows. The next victim was a 16-year-old mentally disabled man called Fred Brooks. Fred Brooks died a truly horrific death, and after his death, the killers, Jamie Vlasakis and John Bunting, continued to claim welfare benefits in his name. Because Fred Brooks was schizophrenic, he only had to give medical certificates like once every 3 months. So the killers continued to claim welfare benefits in the name of Fred Brooks right up until the day of their arrest. Now, Fred Brooks was, as I said, he was schizophrenic, and he was also very young, so he would have been easy to manipulate. And what they did was they made it seem like a game. Jamie Vlasakis put handcuffs on his wrists and said to Fred Brooks, "Fred, why don't you try?" And they put the handcuffs on Fred Brooks's wrists, and then Robert Wagner came up behind him. Robert Wagner was a huge man. People used to call him Lurch because he was so big and tall. He came up behind him and put his forearm around Fred Brooks's neck, and he was trapped. Fred Brooks endured an entire day and night of torture. What they did to him was unbelievable. They injected him with water in his groin and his penis and his legs. They injected him with bleach. They forced lit sparklers into the tip of his penis, into his urethra. They burnt him with cigarettes. They electrocuted him with a Variac machine. This went on for at least 18 hours. He was beaten, he was burned, he was humiliated, he was injected with chemicals, and then after he was strangled, when his body was found, the bits that were left, he had a gag in his mouth. It's possible he choked on the gag, but since the neck bones were broken, it's more likely that he was strangled. After his death, he was dismembered and defleshed and put into the barrels. The next victim was a tiny, mentally and physically disabled man called Gary O'Dwyer. Gary O'Dwyer could not possibly have defended himself from these people, especially Robert Wagner. At the beginning of their crime spree, they justified their murders and tortures, especially John Bunting and Robert Wagner, by saying that they were protecting the community from pedophiles. But Gary O'Dwyer was not a pedophile. He was not a danger in any way. The reason they targeted him was because he was on the highest level of welfare benefits. Because of his disability, he was getting the top rate of disability pensions, and that is why they targeted him. So the justification for their murders has fallen through from we're protecting the community to I don't like him very much to he's got a bit of money, let's get him. I mean, they were just looking for the right type of person to kill. They were just looking for the right kind of target, and that's what Gary O'Dwyer was. He was a small, puny man who was mentally disabled, who had the highest rate of disability benefits, and because of that he was targeted by this despicable band of killers. Gary O'Dwyer was jumped from behind by Robert Wagner in a chokehold. He always used to choke his victims like this with his forearm, and that sent him into convulsions. And John Bunting said, no, lay off a bit, you know, we want this to last. And Gary O'Dwyer was literally tortured to death. The next victim is the wife of Mark Hayden, a mum of 7 who was pregnant with her 8th child. Elizabeth Hayden had come from an extremely poverty-stricken background. All her children were by different fathers. Mark Hayden would beat her oldest 2 children severely, lock them in their room all night, so if they wet the bed or went to the toilet in their bedroom, they were not allowed to change, they were not allowed to wash or change into clean clothes, and they were beaten and sent to school in that condition. The teacher said nothing, the mother said nothing. You know, in these cases there is so many failures of teachers, failures of social services, failures of people who are put into the community to protect the vulnerable because there's no funding. There's either no funding or there's active corruption. And this was the case with the children of Elizabeth Hayden. Now, Elizabeth Hayden was jumped by John Bunting and Robert Wagner. Robert Wagner put his hand on her neck and forced her to kneel like a samurai under the sword. She was forced to call her relatives and scream abuse down the phone, and then she was strangled with a ligature. After her death, she was again dismembered and put into the barrel. The last victim was by no means a pedophile or a sexual deviant. He was a clean-cut, nice kid. His name was David Johnson, a 24-year-old stepbrother of Jamie Vlasakis. What makes this murder so outrageous is that when this happened, all 4 of the killers were under police surveillance. David Johnson was lured out to the bank in Snowtown by his stepbrother Jamie Vlasakis, who said to him that there was a cheap computer there that David Johnson could buy. As he's driving out to the bank in Snowtown, he calls John Bunting and says, "I've got a present for you." And John Bunting says, "This is the voice of happiness, bring it straight in." Jamie Vlasakis would later testify in court that when Robert Wagner and John Bunting talked about the murders they had committed, that they were like kids who'd been bought a toy. He said, you know when you buy a kid a toy and the kid gets really, really excited? It was like that. That's how they used to talk about their murders. And that's how he was talking on the phone right now. So David Johnson comes into the bank, and as soon as he comes into the bank, he gets jumped by Robert Wagner and John Bunting. After David Johnson was killed, Robert Wagner, they dismembered the body, they defleshed the body, they cut the muscles off, they disarticulated the body. Robert Wagner cut a slice off the thigh and wrapped it in a rubber glove. They put the remains of David Johnson into one of the barrels. When they got home, Robert Wagner fried the piece of flesh from the thigh, and him and John Bunting ate that flesh. So they cannibalised David Johnson, a nice kid that they both knew. This act, this heinous, disgusting act of cannibalism would have bound the killers closer together. It would have been ritualistic, and it would have been an act of transgression that would have excited them both, particularly John Bunting. Now, let's delve in to the psyche and the personality of the four killers. John Justin Bunting was a typical archetypal psychopath. He had anosmia, he had no sense of smell, and he was born without a sense of smell. The reason that this is significant is that anosmia indicates damage to the frontal lobes of the brain. If you have no sense of smell, it means that the frontal lobes of your brain are not functioning properly, and that causes and is the cause of psychopathy. John Justin Bunting, in a word, was born evil. He had loving parents who cared about him, but by all accounts, although this was never confirmed by him, he was raped at the age of 8 by a friend's older brother, who strapped them both to a bed and then invited his friends round, put cigarettes out on him and raped him. And from that time, apparently, he became obsessed with gay people and pedophiles and his hatred of them. But John Bunting's non-guilty plea means that there was no psychiatric admissions to the court, and John Bunting himself has never confirmed this story to be either true or false. John Bunting was born evil, he was born psychopathic, and he simply wanted an excuse to torture and murder people. Robert Wagner was born in 1971. He was dyslexic, he was very slow, he was illiterate, but he was huge. He was a big, big man. He was the archetypal henchman. He was, he was big, he was slow, he would take orders, he wanted somebody to look up to, and he looked up to John Bunting. Mark Hayden was dismissed by the judge as a passive manservant. He was given a non-parole period of 18 years, which means he will actually be out of prison quicker than Jamie Vlasakis, because the judge fairly accurately, I think, just dismissed him as, somebody who was helping to move the bodies. Certainly he was there for some of the murders, but he did not show anything like the level of involvement of John Bunting and Robert Wagner. Arguably, the most interesting of the four killers is Jamie Vlasakis. Jamie Vlasakis met John Bunting when he was 14. When John Bunting began a relationship with his mother, Jamie Vlasakis had been raped both by his father and by a neighbour, Jeffrey Payne. Jeffrey Payne was rumoured to be a friend of Barry Lane's. Jamie Vlasakis was an extremely disturbed young man. He was a heroin addict by the time he was 16, and by the time he was 18, he had participated in at least 6 murders. He was given a non-parole period of 21 years. Robert Wagner and Barry Lane, as I said, lived together, and later on, when Robert Wagner, after Barry Lane was killed and Robert Wagner went to live with a woman, his living arrangements were the same. He was rumoured to live in filthy houses, like properly filthy houses, whereas Jamie Vlasakis was obsessed with cleanliness. He would scrub the house from top to bottom twice a day. He would scrub himself in the shower so much that he bled. He would take 2 or 3 showers a day and stay in the shower for ages just scrubbing himself. He had a lot of self-hatred because of his abuse. Now, in the late 1990s, detectives in South Adelaide had a policy of chasing up missing persons cases, and because of this they came across the names of Barry Lane, Clinton Chesize and Elizabeth Hayden. When they realised that Robert Wagner was accessing Barry Lane's money, and he'd also been linked to at least 3 missing people, John Bunting and Robert Wagner were put under police surveillance. As I said, they were under police surveillance when David Johnson was killed. The task force chart is a team of 33 officers, and these were the ones dealing with the disappearance. They traced Elizabeth Hayden's 4x4 to a bank vault in Snowtown. When they got to the bank vault, they found a room at the back that was covered in black plastic. When they slit the black plastic and went in, they said immediately they were assaulted by the smell of rotting flesh. There were 6 big black barrels in that bank vault, containing the remains of 8 people. 2 more people were buried in the garden. 1 was found in a shallow grave at lower light, and 1 had been hung. The author Salman Rushdie once said of Adelaide that it was the perfect setting for a Stephen King novel. Sleepy, conservative towns are where horrific things happen. In Adelaide, there has been some very high-profile cases of sexual deviancy and serial murder. The Bevan von Eyman case, the family murders. In Adelaide, there is rumoured to be a high elite band of pedophiles that are judges, social workers, police officers, accountants, public school, middle class people preying on poor and disadvantaged children from children's homes and foster care. Unfortunately, a lot of these cases have since been proven to be true. QC Magistrate Peter Liddy, Judge and Magistrate Peter Liddy was convicted in 2001 of the rape of 7 boys under the age of 7 and the sexual assaults of boys between the ages of 7 and 12. Bevan von Einem was convicted of 5 murders, then known as the family murders, and just like the UK, they are rumoured, in the UK there's rumours of elite paedophilia, and unfortunately this also seems to be the case in Adelaide. In Salisbury North, where the Snowtown murders were committed, you had generation after generation of people that had no expectation of employment, generation after generation, generational abuse, pedophilia and abuse and rape that had been handed down from generation to generation. When you have that kind of pain and abuse and that crushing lack of self-esteem and pain, people will either destroy themselves or they will destroy others, and we need to understand these cases so that history does not repeat itself. We need to invest in our community, and public service needs real investment. We need to educate people and care for people so that we can break these cycles of abuse that go on generation after generation. In this case, there was rumours of foster care corruption, social work corruption, people actively preying on the vulnerable, but also the vulnerable preying on each other. Now, as I said, the only real solution to this is real community investment. It's important to care for one another so that history does not repeat itself again. John Bunting had a clear case of self-hatred and projection. He clearly had homosexual tendencies that he hated in himself. Robert Wagner was in a gay relationship for years. After he met John Bunting, he began to hate gay people, and before the death of Barry Lane, he severely beat Barry Lane for weeks before he actually killed him, and would actually go out to gay nightclubs, as he's beating up gay people. I'm not going to repeat what he said. He would be beating up gay people. So both John Bunting and Robert Wagner had clear cases of self-hatred and projection. Mark Hayden was just an immoral, man who was incapable of thinking for himself. Jamie Vlasakis was an extremely damaged young man who I hope we will not regret letting back out into society again. This has been the Snowtown case. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you to all my new subscribers. I really appreciate each and every one of you. This is Filthy Ketchup. Stay safe out there.